I'm really very excited to be here. It's really wonderful to be here, and I look forward to the discussions that we'll have. So what I'd like to do is talk about the work that we do at Seymour, and particularly the things that I've been doing around disaster response and digital ethics. So you could argue that we are living through a great mobilities transformation. Finally, people are starting to wake up to the fact that the chances of the human race surviving the 21st century are 1 in 2, which we've known for quite a while, really, but people are now, at least some, are waking up to the fact. And this is a screenshot from Toyota's website. Their strategy to 2050 is to reduce CO2 by 90%. They're still trying to do it by keeping the car and keeping automobility, and of course they would, inventing new kinds of cars with electric vehicles, personal hydrogen vehicles, and different kinds of cars. I call it the Great Mobilities Transformation because it is a great transformation, and we've had that before. I take the term from Polanyi, who argued that we lived through a great transformation before. So in 1944, he argued that to allow the market mechanism to be the sole director of the fate of human beings and their natural environment would result in the demolition of society. And of course, he hasn't been wrong. The neoliberal transformation has really caused a lot of destruction and caused a lot of transformations in our social lives. So in a way we have become what Polanyi feared, the rational Homo economicus, driven by rational decisions and rational selfish calculations. But at the same time, we have not. In this survey by the Common Ground Foundation, 74% of the people questioned hold compassionate values. That's kindness, values of solidarity, and placing a lot of emphasis on equality. But 77% of the people questioned also believe that other people hold selfish values. So be more concerned about status and self-interest and personal accumulation of wealth. And those who hold those beliefs about other people are much less likely to act on social and environmental concerns that they might have. They're far less likely to become engaged in civil action and feel a sense of cultural estrangement. So, in a way, through these transformations, even though many of us don't really want this to happen, we have become inhuman. So this is just a few figures about the kinds of things that these discrepancies of the values that we hold are allowing to happen under people's noses. We all know about this and don't do very much about it. So climate change, of course, is a huge driver of this, and all reports say that if we don't do anything within the next 12 years, we really are going to be seeing very significant destructive forces on our world. And of course, transport, alongside with energy, is a very important contributing factor to this. And the way we are going at the moment is that the things that we are doing and the things that we should be doing are becoming wider and wider apart. So we are really heading for a 3-degree world. And the people who are responsible for it are not the ones taking responsibility in terms of making changes around this happen. So, and climate change and CO2 is only one amongst many wicked problems that we face around this. The ways in which we have organized our social and economic practices. So it's also destructive of soil, so we're losing about 30 soccer fields of soil every minute. Air pollution is rising, and there are many other problems involved in this. So at the Center for Mobilities Research and also the Institute for Social Futures, we have become more and more engaged in thinking, as John Ory put it, that the future is now. So there was in the 1960s French revolutions, there were graffiti on the walls of the Sorbonne saying that the future will only contain what we put in it now. So what we do now really matters, and John Ory argues this in his book, What is the Future? And he also draws on Ruth Levitter's work, who argues that, drawing on Wells, that the creation of utopia and the critique of existing instantiations of utopian thinking are the method of sociological research. So it's about critiquing how past utopias have come into being in the present, and how that shapes what it means to be human, and how to go from there and think about how worlds could be different. And the utopian method is a method that is inherently holistic, so it thinks about the world in terms of the social institutions, the social practices. So it is inherently a systemic outlook onto the world. And this is something that really drives my thinking around this. So mobile utopia as kind of blueprints of the world, and I saw that one of the previous seminar series was about smart city developments. They are very powerful ways of thinking about the world and shaping the world. So they are performative of our present, but also of our future, and performative of our subjectivities. So what you see here is a contrast between a real world street with a very mixed use and forms of interaction and negotiated interactions in a very complex way, which in many blueprints, utopias of future cities, becomes a lot cleaner and tidier. And there are even thoughts about, well, it's never going to work unless people can be more sensible. So what you see at the top there is an attempt to try and discipline pedestrians so that they are not endangered by autonomous vehicles. So what does that do to who we are and what kind of worlds we're living in? I'd argue that the kind of datafication that is inherent in the smart city idea really impoverishes life. It enacts the rational subject, and it really is a very reductive way of thinking about how we operate. So as if decisions about crossing a road were just about getting from A to B, when actually streets and how people cross roads and how people behave in streets and interact with each other are about so much more. If you think about Jane Jacobs' work and work about the right to the city and how cities are actually made in the diversity of encounters that people have on the streets, then disciplining people, because we need to make our transport systems more efficient and less congested and less CO2 emitting, in a way that fits the machine, really diminishes what our streets mean and how we can interact in them, and then thereby it also really diminishes what it means that we can be and how we can enact our right to the city. So I would argue that the mobile interaction order and the way in which people are able to negotiate how we fit diverse forms of moving around into streets is really an engine of humanity. And so if datafication is designed to discipline, then it really drives out humanity. Many of the blueprint visions of the future, this is the cycling superhighway that is designed to get the people who still work in the city in London from the suburbs faster into their workplaces by Arup, that are designed to enact this kind of time-space compression, really illustrate what I've just said. However, they are not the only thing that's happening. So people are actually living different forms of mobility. There are many grassroots initiatives like this. Cargonomics is a service of growing food locally and distributing it with cargo bikes locally. And Cosmin Popan has just published a book on slow cycling Utopia, where he talks about how such ways of living alternatives actually are generative of alternative social worlds from the bottom of the fuel. And so we are very inspired by such prefigurative, so prefigurative in the sense of living different kinds of futures and trying to make them as concrete as possible. That's what people are doing. So we are trying to think of how can we use creative methods to really amplify such prefigurative movements. And we do lots of crazy things. So every picture that you see there stands for a story and for a project that tries to play with ways of creating different social worlds. And I'll just give you one example. So here we were trying to think about, well, what does it do to bring autonomous vehicles into the mobile interaction order on streets? How can we analyze that through dance? And so we thought, we'll try and dance your vehicle and become sensical. So we had a choreographer and a few dancers. And so we started out by just dancing street life. And then we introduced these machines. So every cardboard box is a form of automated transport, which has certain rules. And then we started to behave in those rules. And those rules were, of course, invisible to the others. So it led to collisions and to difficult situations. So what we're trying to do with things like that is to make pockets of futures inhabitable and experienceable, so that you can start to play with the unintended consequences, the experiences, the practices that will emerge. So it's a playful way of doing it, and that's one approach that we take. But in my work, I've also worked in a different way, or in this way, really, to be honest, but in more serious contexts. And the reason why I do that is because the way we've designed data has been kind of the lowest difficulty path. So engineers and technology developers see that smart cities are possible, and they are designing technologies in a way that, yes, it's very complicated and it's very difficult to do, but they are picking up the problems that are actually the simple problems. So it is not, so they, they see a street congested, and they see the what are they called, random traffic jams. They see the mathematical reasons for why traffic jams happen on motorways, for example. And then, of course, to avoid traffic jams, what you have to do is make every vehicle move at the same speed and stop people from accelerating and slowing down and accelerating and slowing down. Because that's one thing that generates random traffic jams. So then if you have automated transport, where you make it so that everything moves smoothly, then you don't have traffic jams, you don't have congestion. It's a very logical way of going about it, but they haven't thought about how people are to interact with it, and that's where then these kind of disciplining moves come in to try and keep people to that rational flow. But if you think about it, why don't you design machines that can read human intentions and that can document their own operation in a way that is understandable for people, so that you don't cut off people's multiplicity and diversity of behaving and moving around. So I would argue this has been assigned to Beethoven, this idea that difficult is good, difficult is beautiful, and closer to the truth. So my question is, how can we enact a better digital ethics? And yes, that is a difficult question, and I address it in a difficult context. So I've been working with disaster risk managers, so fire service, the police, local authorities who are dealing with floods, and we have the M6 going past Lancaster University, so it's large-scale motorway accidents. And there, the sharing of data, and you will see a bit more about that as I go on. If you're a victim in a car crash, of course you would want the emergency services to be able to access all your medical data and to know who your next of kin are. But the question is often, when does the emergency end? How can the sharing of data be allowed and then stopped again? And it's not just for members of the public where that is a question, but it's also for the emergency responders themselves. If they are wearing body-worn cameras and are augmented with devices that have algorithms in them, and their every move is tracked, how are they going to be held responsible for what they did? It's a very important issue for them. So I would, this is how we're thinking about it, that datafication in disaster risk management is an extreme challenge that allows us to think through this and the opportunities for designing it differently in relation to other domains as well. And so he is thinking, and he is thinking with me, that difficult is a good thing. So I'll give you a bit of a glimpse into just what the challenges are in disaster response. So this is from the Tohoku earthquake and Fukushima disaster in 2011. And what you see there is many different international and national agencies working together under extreme conditions. There are many different cultures and different interests involved in this. So even in quite a small incident, you immediately have different actors involved. So you have all the first responders, but you also have the cooperating actors. So the category 2 responders, they're often called, the transport agencies, the electricity boards. You have the media interested. The public, of course, is going on social media and of course interested in it. You have all the non-governmental agencies. You also have commercial agencies like supermarkets or hotels who can help, who are coming into it. And they all have data that might be interesting, or that they might want data. So insurances, for example, might want some information. Okay. So we are thinking that this is one area where it's interesting, but it could spread to, so datafication is happening in disaster risk management, but also in healthcare, in transport, in cities, government and policies, in advertising and businesses. So, the generation of data can be under sometimes very extreme context. So this is a picture from the Eurowings crash in the French Alps, where people were collecting, in part, very gruesome body parts to be identified by DNA, but also any kind of mobile devices that were collected there. And that kind of mobile work, going around collecting data and coordinating the response, is anchored in centers of coordination where people are control rooms, but also mobile whiteboards where people are keeping track of who's where and all that sort of thing. And some of the challenges that emergency responders have in managing all those kind of information flows is expressed in this interview with a police officer who was at the Oslo bombing. He says, I have to say it, I have to speak it out on the radio, and I'm not sure that everybody's listening on the radio. So the problem with these big accidents is that you're being so much tied up on your radio. We say in Norwegian, you're getting radioactive. You use the radio all the time, and then you forget to look, and you forget to hear, and to feel the situation about you. So managing all the information is actually making it very difficult for him to be in the situation and to interact with people and understand what's going on. Another problem, this image will bring some dark memories for people here. Perhaps it's the London bombings, and when people came out of the tube station, they were received by people like the Red Cross or ambulances, and they had data taken about their name, their address, their basic personal data. And then they were sent on to the next agency, so they were sent to the hospital or to other counseling services, and there they had to give all that information again. And that was actually quite distressing for people, so much so that it sparked, it became part of a post-disaster review effort where a guidance was produced that would show and tell emergency services that in an emergency like that, they are allowed, it is perfectly legitimate and legal to share that kind of personal information between the agencies, and they should share such information because damage is done by not sharing information. Does that all make sense to you? This is another example. It is from the Oslo bombings. I don't know if you remember the story there, but there was a bomb in the Oslo government district. And a few minutes after it happened, somebody actually called into the incident room and said to the call taker in the emergency room, I saw what I thought was a policeman, but then I was surprised. A man with a protective helmet and police clothes and a drawn pistol who came up behind me near the government building. I hesitated a little, surprised that he was walking alone, and I just followed him out of the corner of my eye. Then he got into a car, a grey van, with the following license number, and she reads out the license number. And the call taker writes it on a post-it and takes the post-it and takes it into the command incident room and puts it on the table of the chief commander. And they don't find that information for about 20 minutes and then don't act on it. And they've been absolutely hammered for this, very strongly criticized for many things, including that. And in the post-disaster report, the expert report, this is what they do. They take that license number, and that vehicle had a GPS in it, and they actually track that vehicle in relation to police cars on the roads. So they identify various moments where the perpetrator's car crosses a police vehicle on his way to the island of Utopia, where he then shot around 80 young people. And they really heavily criticize the police for something that they could have known had they used the technology properly. And they also make a big point out of them not using technology properly. And that is a very common thing within the disaster emergency world, that a lack of interoperability and communication problems are seen as the most common problems. And that, of course, is oil on the fire of technological innovation, and technology developers like Airbus and Motorola and Nokia. That's exactly what they think they can fix. And so there are various movements like this. So this is from Japan, and something that actually worked quite well there, where you have a common cloud, and then you have all the different data services that people are using and that different agencies are using. So you've got everything from electricity suppliers to insurances to the personal data to health data to insurance data, and it can be used for different purposes. So they are opening the gates between different kinds of databases. And this is an example from the EU, where we have the Schengen Information System, the Exit and Entry System, the Visa System, the Europol data. And Europe has a democratic process, and these are very delicate and significant repositories of personal data. So there is no attempt to connect those different databases. But what they are arguing is you can have a shared biometric matching service, and then you can identify people who have become noticed in different systems, and then they might be of interest to some of the agencies. And so this is a consultation document, and when it was put to consultation, the European Data Protection Supervisor, you don't need to read the whole thing, pulled out a few issues that are highly problematic around this. So one of the things that he mentions is that actually the existence or lack of flags constitutes personal data in itself, and it goes against purpose limitation. So if the data is collected for one purpose and then suddenly becomes used for another purpose, that is not in the the intention of it, and it goes against our civil rights. And also that it should be known what we should do with this, what this information is collected for. And they're not just criticizing it, and they're not acting as a kind of police that says, oh, stop, don't do this. It is much more complicated, it's much more ambiguous. And so one of the reactions at the EDPS was to commission a review of the digital ethics. And that is highly critical of the general data protection regulation that has just come out, which instantiates a kind of purpose binding, because actually the principles of purpose limitation and data minimization actually go against the potential of big data and really curtail what we can do with the technologies. They kind of regulate for a past, not the future, of how we could use the technologies. So these are the kind of things that are behind our thinking. So when we're looking at it, you have these kind of ambiguities that when your loved ones are involved in a tragic accident, of course you want people to be able to process data and to collect data and to share data. But at the same time, do we really want to live in a world where everything you say and everything you do is being recorded and becomes analyzable? And the responders themselves are feeling similar sort of pressures that, like police officers, for example, are expected to, they have body-worn cameras, but if they go into a situation like a domestic violence situation, they are supposed to not record sensitive data. So then, as they are doing their work becomes much more complicated, because then they have to think, is what I'm doing now, am I capturing sensitive data? Should I turn the camera away, or should I turn my body away not to capture this? And the quote that you've got at the top there is from a paramedic who they are using triage technologies that are driven by, that give them instructions for how to deal with a situation. And they are worried that their professional judgment is undermined, and also that they will be held to account for things that they did if they don't follow the machine. So, so these kind of issues come out again and again in our work with the emergency responders. And this is a project that I've worked on, where then the idea is, well, how can we design common information spaces that are sensitive to these ambiguities, and that try to support a different way of collecting data and of working with technologies. And so the idea of common information spaces that allow people to understand where the data is going, who's in the space, and how to coordinate things. And one of the things that happened when we were working with the responders and the technology designers around this is that they were asking, can you make guidance on all the ethical issues that arise, and what the opportunities are for designing in a more circumspect way around these? And this is where the game comes in. So we made a big book of ethical guidance. So we catalogued all the issues. We made categories, and then had short entries for every issue. So a short description about, for example, how awareness of who's in the common information space can be done. Give some guiding questions for how you can address that in the design of technologies, but also ways of appropriating it into organizational cultures. Give some further information, and then also key terms on solidarity, respect, privacy, with short definitions of it. And that was quite well received, but it is like a big book of guidance. And when we talked to people, yes, it was interesting, but it was very difficult for them to engage in it. And so we translated it into a board game, which is like a tabletop exercise, where your task is to rescue Europe and to do it, you can collaborate and open common information space. And as you do it, you have to have ethical values, and as part of the game, you also then get into situations where you can acquire ethical values by having ethical conversations. And people, so we've played it with emergency responders, with policymakers, with information management professionals, and it really, I've had the experience many times that when you do interviews, they come up with all these ethical issues that they face and how they are resolving them and how they are addressing them. When you talk to a room full of people and you mention ethics, you can see them go to sleep. You can see how people go, ethics, you're going to be difficult about this. But when you have them around a board game and talking to each other, then many of the stories come out. So it's been a very productive tool. And so we've developed an ethical exchange around this. And it's been part of methods of trying to engage responders in mapping and building scenarios, having lots of workshops with them, and using the method of Utopia as architecture to understand how we could design common information spaces differently to support configuring awareness, trust, diverse interpretations, contesting different kinds of information. And I'll give you an example. This image that you see at the bottom here is from a project where we've designed a common information space, drawing in information from sensors, from videos, from CCTV cameras, from mobile GPS units, and all sorts of different technologies, and it's all drawn together into this master table. And that's in a tent command and a control center during an exercise of a shooting in a Norwegian industrial district. And I'll just so the information is live, and it's coming together there. And I'll play you a clip of how people are interacting with it. It doesn't matter. I can just say what he's talking about.
Oh, is it going off?
Now you've turned the other one off as well.
Is it? Oh no, it's on again.
Yep. So he's talking about where the wind is coming from and where different units are, and he was just showing how he could take one of the fire engines and assign it to a different place by dragging and dropping it onto a different place, and then giving him a different job. And when we were experimenting with that, so we built a prototype, we made it functional so that people could actually interact with it and do this. And that is when they did it, because they thought, well, that's a really good idea, we can just assign somebody to go to that place by dragging and dropping them. But then they had lots of discussions around how that would be very difficult, because at the moment they have a dialogue. It's assigned by having a dialogue, and so the people who are being assigned to a different job have a say in it. And it can be that they actually have a different job, or they have the situation is much more complicated than is visible from a dot on a map. And so that doesn't mean don't do it. It means when you're doing it, make it so that it's easy to open a communication channel at the same time. So it's not about understanding what to do and what not to do. It's about understanding how to do the innovation in a way that is productive and really true to the conditions of the work that's being done. This is another example of work that we've done at the Public Safety Communications Europe Network Conference, which brings together practitioners. So at the table here you've got the Slovenian Civil Contingencies Minister, you've got somebody from an IT company, and you've got somebody from Airbus designing mission critical communications networks. And they are working on a scenario of an emergency, thinking about what would they do with 5G. And what as part of the Is It Ethical exchange work, building on the guidance that we've developed and the tabletop exercise, we've also made these kind of injects. So you've got a card on informational self-determination that as they're working through the scenario of how they would work with 5G communications, you then ask them how does this affect informational self-determination, and then people have really interesting discussions that are really anchored in the concrete detail of how they've made these scenarios. And you can't hear it, so there's no point playing it. But we had several groups there developing these kind of scenarios and engaging in these kind of ethical conversations. So what I wanted to do is to show you how people are appropriating new technologies is actually quite creative and prefigurative of futures that are accommodating of the complexities of how we need to work with information. But our technologies and our ambitions for how we design them, how we build them into it, are very low. We expect far too little from the technology design and far too little from our policies of how we should use technologies. And that is performative of highly problematic issues. And so I think we should be far more normative about it, because we have responsibilities to make the great mobilities transformation, which must happen. And if we are, as we are, turning to data to such an extent and put our eggs in the smart city basket, that will really help us reduce our emissions, then what kind of data wills and informational self-determination restrictions are we placing on ourselves, and how can we do this differently? So that's why I think mobilizing Utopia as method is a really productive way of thinking about it, and that's where I would like to stop. And if you would like to have a look at the game and play a bit, then you'd be very welcome, but open for questions, of course.